Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. She was pregnant, but no one in the town dared to ask who the father was. Whispers spread like wildfire through the valleys and hollow houses, but every mouth fell silent the moment someone pressed for the truth. Some claimed it was her brother, others believed it was her own father. And the most unsettling rumor of all, the one that sent shivers through anyone brave enough to repeat it, was that she had been carrying the child of a man who was not just kin, but the very blood that raised her. In the shadowed corners of forgotten America, stories like this were never written down in newspapers. They were traded in hushed voices, passed like curses from one generation to the next. Entire families lived like ghosts, tucked away in remote cabins, their bloodlines looping back upon themselves until children were born with faces that told the story no one dared to speak aloud. This is not the story of an outsider, a stranger, or a fleeting scandal. This is the story of a child, born from a union so tangled in secrecy and sin, the truth was never meant to surface. But history has a cruel way of dragging its secrets into the light. Tonight, we unravel one of the darkest tales buried in the forgotten soil of America's past. A story of silence, of shame, and of a bloodline that folded in upon itself until a girl, barely more than a child, was forced to carry within her the weight of generations. She was pregnant, but no one knew who the father was. And when the child was born, the town realized something they could never unsee. The girl's name has long been lost to official records, erased deliberately or buried beneath layers of denial. What remains are fragments, whispered recollections from old townsfolk, weathered journal entries, and the unshakable memory of a child whose very existence brought fear into the hearts of everyone around. She lived in a cabin far from the main road, a place where no stranger would wander by accident. Her family was known for keeping to themselves. They worked their own land, traded rarely, and spoke even less. Generations of isolation had created something more than secrecy. It had created a prison. Inside those walls, kin became lovers, fathers became husbands, and daughters became mothers of children they were never meant to bear. By the time she was 14, her body carried the undeniable sign of life growing inside her. Neighbors noticed but chose not to speak. They had seen it before. Cousins who suddenly became fathers, uncles who blurred the lines of blood. But this case was different. No man from outside the family had ever been seen visiting. No suitor ever dared to step near that household. So the whispers began, the father must be one of their own. Some swore it was her brother, a boy no older than 17 with a vacant stare and a mind that had never seemed quite right. Others whispered it was her father, a man hardened by years of silence and suspicion. And then there were those who lowered their voices to nothing more than a breath, daring to suggest that her own grandfather, the patriarch who ruled the cabin with fear and ritual, was the true father. The girl never spoke of it. She carried her silence like a second skin, her eyes downcast, her lips sealed shut even when questioned. But her pregnancy told a story all its own. The blood of her child would not be fresh or new, it would be recycled, folded and fractured. A body made from the same bones then, that had already intertwined too many times before. The birth was expected in secret, away from doctors, away from questions. But there was one thing no one could control. When the child came into the world, it carried the unmistakable mark of its own cursed origin. The years that followed were marked by an unnatural quiet. The family lived as though nothing had happened. They tilled their land, hunted in the woods, and nodded politely if they ever crossed paths with townsfolk. But behind their cabin walls, the child grew. No one in town knew for certain if it was a boy or a girl. No one dared ask. But stories trickled out, carried on the lips of children who wandered too close, or hunters who swore they glimpsed movement in the trees. Some claimed the child never spoke a word, not even as it aged. Others said it made noises, but not human ones, low sounds, guttural, almost animal. The family, however, seemed to treat it as ordinary. They walked with it hand in hand when the sun was low. They brought it into the fields at dawn, keeping it far from the road where no stranger could catch a glimpse. And yet the darker whispers suggested something more, that the child was not only being hidden, but being prepared to continue what the family had always done: marry within, conceive within, keep the blood sealed like a tomb. This was not the first time the town had faced rumors of inbreeding, but this case struck differently. This child was not a shame to be buried, nor a mistake to be hidden in silence. It was living proof of the family's devotion to themselves, a devotion so absolute it blurred the lines between love and cruelty, between loyalty and madness. Old church records later hinted that a preacher was once called to the cabin. His handwriting in the parish journal spoke only one chilling line: "I have seen the child. It will never leave these woods." No explanation, no elaboration, just a statement of finality. That entry was dated only 3 years after the birth, which raises a haunting question. What did that preacher see that left him so certain? Did the child already show signs of the same twisted cycle that had created it? Or did he know something the rest of the town feared to ask, that another generation had already begun? The silence of the family was not ignorance, it was ritual. It was the kind of silence that protects a curse, feeding it with secrecy. And in time, that silence grew heavier than any scream. The birth itself was a night of terror. No midwife, no doctor, not even a neighbor came to help. Only the family was there, locked inside that cabin while the wind howled outside. For hours, the girl screamed into the dark, her cries carrying across the fields. Some in town later swore they heard it, though no one dared to follow the sound. They knew better. That cabin was a place you did not go. When the baby arrived, silence fell. Not the silence of peace, but of shock. Those who later spoke about it, though never publicly and never without fear, said the infant was unlike any they had ever seen. Its features were twisted, fragile, almost unfinished, as though nature itself had tried to resist creating it. The eyes were too close, the forehead too large, the mouth slack as though the muscles had forgotten their purpose. The family did not mourn. They did not celebrate. They simply accepted the child as another shadow in their bloodline, as though such births were no longer surprising, but expected. For them, deformity was not tragedy. It was inheritance. Still, questions haunted the nearby town. Whispers grew darker. Who had fathered the child? The brother, the father, the grandfather? Each theory was worse than the last, and yet no one demanded the truth. Perhaps they were too afraid of what it might confirm, because to speak it aloud would be to admit that their little town harbored something monstrous, something passed down like an heirloom. Years later, one woman who lived on the edge of those woods confessed in a trembling voice that she saw the baby once. She described it as not fully human, not in the sense of a beast, but in the sense of absence, as though it had been born missing some essential piece of the soul. The way she told it, looking into that child's eyes, was like staring into a mirror that refused to recognize you. And yet, the family raised the child. They fed it, clothed it, kept it hidden from the world. Outsiders never saw it again, and some began to wonder if it even survived past infancy. But if it did, then it meant the cursed bloodline had not ended that night. It had only grown stronger. By the time the child reached what should have been adolescence, the town had stopped pretending not to notice. Strange sightings became harder to dismiss. Farmers on the edge of the woods reported seeing pale figures moving just beyond the tree line. Sometimes there was more than one. Sometimes, they said, the shapes didn't move quite right, too stiff or too bent, as if their bodies weren't built for walking upright. It was then that the real fear began to spread. The child, it seemed, was no longer a child, and worse, there were whispers of another pregnancy in the house. No one could say for certain. No midwife was ever called, no doctor ever visited, but a neighbor swore he saw a swollen belly through a crack in the curtain. And what disturbed him most was not the shape of the body, but the age of the one carrying it. Too young, far too young. This was the nightmare no one wanted to face, that the cycle had already continued, that the child born of inbreeding had been forced into it, repeating the same trauma, ensuring the family's bloodline was sealed tighter than ever before. Still, no law stepped in, no sheriff forced entry. The town carried on, heads down, eyes averted. Perhaps it was easier not to know. Perhaps they feared that confronting the family would only drag the curse out of the woods and into their own homes. But diaries, journals, and letters from that time reveal one consistent truth. Everyone knew, and everyone chose silence. It wasn't just the family keeping secrets anymore. It was the whole town, an unspoken pact of ignorance woven from fear and shame. And so the story spread beyond the county, whispered from one state to the next, until it became less a tale of a family and more a symbol of what people are willing to ignore when the truth becomes unbearable. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have turned them in or kept your head down just like the townsfolk did? The answer may haunt you more than the story itself. Decades passed and still the family remained hidden in plain sight. The woods grew thick around the old house, swallowing it until only a crumbling roofline could be seen from the road, but the bloodline, as broken as it was, had not died out. Local records confirm sporadic births, children with no fathers listed, mothers with no surnames, and when outsiders came asking questions, those records had a way of disappearing, replaced with blanks and smudges, as if the county clerk's ink had run dry at just the right moment. The most disturbing discovery came much later, when a box of letters was unearthed from a farmhouse basement during a foreclosure. They were never meant to be found. Inside, scrawled on yellowing paper, was the voice of someone inside the bloodline itself. A woman, young, barely literate, but painfully aware of what was happening. She wrote of her father-brother, of carrying a child whose face she feared to see, of praying that her baby would not live to suffer what she had. One line in particular freezes the blood. "We are not people like them. We are born from each other, and we will die inside each other." Historians who studied these letters argued over their authenticity, but locals swore they were real. Some even said they remembered the girl, her hollow eyes, her silence, the way she never lifted her head in church. And when asked about the child she carried, they all gave the same answer. It was born, but no one ever saw it again. The tragedy is not just in the family's suffering, but in the way their community enabled it. This was not a secret held by one house. It was a shadow cast over an entire town, a stain they could never scrub away. For every victim trapped inside those walls, there were dozens outside who chose not to act. Even now, the descendants of those townsfolk rarely speak of it. But when pressed, they confess one chilling truth. Everyone knew. And yet, for reasons they still cannot fully explain, no one stopped it. The silence was not ignorance, it was complicity. What happened to that family is not just an isolated horror buried in the woods. It is a mirror, one that reflects the darkest corners of human nature, where shame, silence, and survival twist together into something unrecognizable. We may tell ourselves it was just one family, one house, one tragedy left to rot in the past. But the truth is, history hides countless stories just like this. Families erased from record, children who never stood a chance, secrets whispered only behind closed doors. The girl who carried that child, whose father was also her brother, whose very existence was a prison. She never escaped. Her story ended where it began, in silence. The baby she birthed, the most inbred child ever born, became little more than a rumor. Some say it died within days. Others believe it lived, hidden from the world, raised in the same cycle of shame. No one can prove either version, but the chilling reality is this: someone, somewhere, still carries that bloodline. And if you think that sounds impossible, remember this: every town has its shadows, every family its secrets. The horror of this story isn't that it happened once, it's that it could happen again. The land where the house once stood is quiet now, Trees have swallowed the last traces of wood and stone. Children ride bikes down the same roads, never knowing what happened in the fields beyond. The town pretends it's all forgotten, but silence does not erase truth. It only buries it deeper, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it back up. And tonight you've done exactly that. You've walked with me through a story you were never supposed to hear, a history your grandfather would have denied, a bloodline America itself tried to bury. The question is, now that you know, what will you do with it? Because if one thing is certain, it's this: some stories never die. They linger, generation after generation, carried in whispers, in scars, in blood. And somewhere out there, someone still remembers the child who was born, but should never have been.